Especially thanks to Jess for coming. She, poor woman, already deals with my nerdery pretty regularly as it applies to this subject and volunteered to actually show up. Anybody come to the one last year? Oh, good. Yeah, this one's not as cheery. Last year it was cocktails. This lecture may make you want to drink, but for radically different reasons. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some assumptions that I have made before presenting this, and give some disclaimers. I'm not a theologian, okay? I'm just not. And I'm by no stretch of the imagination an expert on the history of the Catholic Church or its broader teachings in general. The subject matter of nuclear conflict interests me primarily because as a child growing up briefly in upstate New York, we lived in a small community called Niskuna. Niskuna is an affluent suburb of Schenectady in the Capital District area, far upstate New York, far from the city. Niskuna is home to General Electric's theoretical laboratories, as well as Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory. Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory does research on the nuclear propellant systems for our naval vessels and other work, whatever that may be. That meant that this strange and sleepy little community in upstate New York that Jess and I grew up in, which at the time had a population of less than 15,000, was a tier 1 target during the Cold War. We would have been first. We certainly would have probably been an overkill as well, particularly given the manufacturing side of General Electric was located there in Schenectady. So the probability of a nuclear confrontation with the then Soviet Union meant that this beautiful, sleepy little community would have been vaporized, sublimated is the technical term, pretty quickly in the first go-around, and that was a strange shadow to live under as a child. And we are seeing some of the some return of that kind of shadow now. Those of you who are living here in Weatherford or are close to Weatherford are certainly within a tier 1 targeted strike zone now because of Carswell's Joint Naval Air Reserve. But it's worth noting that the Dallas-Fort Worth area would be pretty much first to go anyway because of our extensive military-industrial facilities here in the Metroplex. I've also kind of assumed that not everybody here is Catholic, right? And this is definitely not this is not evangelism, okay? I happen to be going through the conversion process myself and found this to be helpful to some degree with that, particularly given the church's history with respect to issues related to social justice. So I was very curious to see how consistent the pro-life position of the church was. That is, does the pro-life position of the church extend beyond discussions of reproductive rights and abortion? And as it turns out, it does. It does extend much further than that single issue. I found that very attractive, and so here we are. I'll begin by saying that what we know as the nuclear age is now 75 years old, plus or minus some. And we mark this at the beginning of, this age at the Trinity test. 1945, we detonate the first nuclear device in the sands of New Mexico. A small device by comparison certainly to what's deployed now and what we deployed during the Cold War. Nevertheless, that brilliant moment, that moment of light, all of that work, forever altered the landscape of war. So much so that your presence here is an accident of probability in a lot of ways. But for a couple times in history, the weight of good people and people who make good and moral decisions, nobody would be here to observe what the world looked like. That's the cold reality. Early on in the development of the post-Trinity nuclear posture of the United States, Robert Oppenheimer, who was later accused of being a communist, said very famously, in some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, and no overstatements can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, and this is the knowledge which they cannot lose. Robert Oppenheimer ended up having very mixed feelings about what had occurred after Trinity. He began to refer to himself, he says, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds, because they realized that they had unleashed this terrifying new power. Now, the question that might make sense to ask now is, well, why give this lecture now in 2020? What's the point? And the answer to that question is that after the 2016 election, very quickly after the 2016 election, the administration issued its policy desires with respect to the deployment of our nuclear forces that include some sweeping additions and upgrades to our nuclear arsenals. In fact, it's worth noting that the proposed updates, which include everything from updates to existing warheads, the creation and deployment of new warheads, which we'll talk about here in a moment, the creation and deployment of a new class of missile boats, submarines, the Columbia class, the development of a new long-range strategic bomber, which is right now in the development stage, called the B-21, has a price tag right at about $350 billion. $350 billion spent on our nuclear triad. Now, for those of you who've not had me before, you haven't heard this portion of the lecture yet, but we speak of our deployed forces in the United States and worldwide as the triad. The breathtaking alignment of the language that's used in this particular field is fascinating to me. The first test called Trinity. We refer to our forces as the triad. It's always coming back to this idea of the three, which is where the title, the Unholy Trinity, comes from. And particularly because of the Church's strong beliefs about the idea of God in three, right? The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, referred to as the Holy Trinity. But at $350 billion, it's probably okay to sit and talk about whether or not we need to do this. At the end of the day, this is a conversation we don't often have. And if we can frame this in terms of a less technical approach, and perhaps in a more good versus evil, the kind of moral and ethical implications, perhaps it will give us the room we need to have good conversations about expenditures in the near $500 billion mark. I think it is worth noting that we oftentimes talk about how much Medicare costs, but we just don't talk about how much missiles do. And I think that's weird and odd and decidedly American. One of the impetus for this particular lecture was about a year and a half ago, or a year ago, in the anti-nuclear proliferation community and in other communities. We began hearing whispers of the desire of the administration to deploy a new type of warhead that we have not deployed before. This would be considered a tactical device, not a strategic device. Strategic devices are the very large ones, the city killers. Tactical devices are intended with the idea that you could make very narrow and pinpoint strikes on military and industrial targets. When we detonated the first device in anger over Hiroshima, that device had a yield, that is a total destructive power, of 15 kilotons. 15 1,000-ton equivalents, right? So a kiloton is 1,000 tons, so 15,000 tons equivalent of TNT. Of course, during the course of the Cold War, the devices got much, much larger as the technology changed, and the method of achieving the explosion altered as well. And by the late 1960s and early 1970s, we were deploying devices that were orders of magnitude larger. We began measuring in megatons, thousands of kilotons, right? So the device that was dropped on Hiroshima at 15 kilotons killed 100,000 people, plus or minus some, in an instant. The devices that would have been deployed during the late 1960s and early 1970s had the capacity to kill many, many, many thousands of times more, because the devices were so large. Obviously, the technicals don't always work out that way. You gotta have all those people crammed together, but that became the backbone of our strategic approach. Recently, military planners have begun to think about dialing down yields, in fact, sub-Hiroshima yields in the 1.5 to 5 kiloton range, very small by comparison. A lot of these devices were intended with the idea that this would prevent a sort of an escalation to de-escalate idea, right? That is, if we are the subject of a first strike, the typical reaction, right, the typical war planning would be for us to massively retaliate, or some version of that, right, with our larger devices. The idea that the threat exists. If you hit us once, you're going to get a lot back. Of course, that then really kind of makes the use of these weapons somewhat obsolete, right? We refer to this as the concepts of mutually assured destruction. The idea with the military planners dialing down to 1.5 or 5 kilotons is the idea that, well, I'm not destroying an entire city. I may be destroying what would be effectively the equivalent of nothing more than Carswell. But that would then disincentivize the other side from retaliating with high yields. But there's a problem, and this problem is one that I think is important for us to think about as we move forward with this discussion. And that is, as our low yield devices went online, they are deployed as of January 1 this year. That was very quick. All of that construction and upgrade on those devices occurred in Texas. There's only one facility that does it right now in the United States, and that facility is just outside of Amarillo. Those devices are deployed on submarines, but they are deployed side by side with large yield devices. Anybody see what the problem is now? If the United States opts for a low yield strike on a target, say North Korea, how does North Korea know what they're receiving? They don't know if they're getting a low yield device, so the rational response would simply be to respond with their highest yield device available. At which point, the idea of the small yield device seems to have defeated itself. Because it's not like these things travel projecting some kind of message that says, don't worry, this is a small yield device. Right? That would be strategically a bad call. The church's approach to war in general is going to kind of be the underpinning, okay? I want to begin with what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says. Now, a catechism, this is something new for the Episcopal. There may be an Episcopal catechism, but in classic Episcopal form, they never told us. Thank you, Scott. I knew there had to have been one in here, right? A catechism is basically a set of principles that guide the church. And they are presented in the form of fixed questions and fixed responses. One of the questions, of course, is what is the church's response with respect to war, and in particularly modern warfare. These portions of the catechism are added in the 1960s. So the first one, every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. The danger of modern warfare is that it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially atomic, biological, and chemical weapons, to commit such crimes. The church considers indiscriminate killing a crime. It's worth pausing here also for a moment to backtrack to those two devices dropped on Japan, the first very famously on Hiroshima, the second dropped on Nagasaki. The Nagasaki bomb was targeted using a Catholic church located in the city of Nagasaki. I did not know that. And my research on that was really distressing because the bomb detonated at a time that there were an estimated 500 or so Catholics dutifully praying and participating in confession at the moment that the bomb went off, and it of course obliterated the church completely and nobody survived. The United States dropped a bomb on praying Christians. That's the full message there. To end the war, but that's the justification, is to end the war. But we need to be really clear about what occurred. We murdered 500 practicing Catholics. Not at home while they were in their church, because we used their church as the targeting key. That's pretty remarkable. When we consider the post-World War II glory and the success of the way that we prosecuted the war and ended the war, we need to remember that it requires of everybody in war to undertake, perhaps at a minimum, crimes against man, at the worst possible, crimes against God. Catechism goes on to say that the accumulation of arms strikes many as paradoxically a suitable way of deterring potential adversaries from war. They see it as the most effective means of ensuring peace among nations. This method of deterrence gives rise to strong moral reservations. The arms race does not ensure peace. Far from eliminating the causes of war, it risks aggravating them. Spending enormous sums to produce ever new types of weapons impedes efforts to aid needy populations. It thwarts the development of peoples. Over-armament multiplies reasons for conflict and increases the danger of escalation. Why this is apropos now, of course, is that the United States development of these low-yield devices and other devices like our own hypersonic missile system are a direct result of Russian efforts to improve and update their own nuclear forces and their rather very public propaganda campaign, I would argue propaganda at a minimum, in which they advise the United States that they have developed so-called hypersonic missiles that travel at many times the speed of sound to deliver warheads, which would ostensibly have the effect of rendering our anti-missile defenses useless, because we couldn't shoot something down going quite that quickly. Additionally, what we've seen over the course of the 75 years of the shadow of the mushroom cloud is a number of leaders of the Catholic faith who have reacted candidly in ways that surprised me. I was surprised how consistent the thread was, given that the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear forces has certainly moved faster than policy in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is not famous for the speed with which they react, but they have been fairly consistent. We began with Pius XII. What I've done is I've tried to give you a sense of the man by their motto. Now, don't ask me to do the Latin, but peace shall be the work of justice. There is embedded in this, I would argue, generational conversation that's occurring with each progressive pope. Another of the emblems, the triads that we see, and each of them comes at this triangle from a different point. Here you have the concept of peace and justice worked together. And some of them will work on love and peace together, or love and justice together. But there does seem to be another triad available, right? The three legs of this stool being peace, justice, and love. Peace, justice, and love. Pius was ardently anti-communist. He viewed that as being inconsistent with the teachings of the church, and generally pretty terrible for the people. After the two devices were detonated over Japan, and particularly after it was discovered that Nagasaki in particular had a very terrible reality for Catholics practicing in that city. Pope Pius says that the nuclear bomb was the most terrible weapon which the human mind has conceived up to date, not least because, he continued, it had been produced by science unmediated by love. And I think that there's something really beautiful about that. The idea here is not that religion, not that Catholicism and science are incompatible. As is often given, there does seem to be generally a zeitgeist in the United States, maybe this is just my perception, of a hard and fast line between religion and science. And yet here Pope Pius is saying that there isn't anything in particularly poor or wrong about science, as long as it is mediated with love. And I think that the love that he's speaking of echoes in what will become the new portions of the Catechism that deal with the idea of the indiscriminate killing of innocents to solve world problems. And that must have really struck home for the church when it was determined that it was in fact a cathedral that guided that second bomb in. Pius dies rather tragically, I think long before people anticipated that he would abdicate his position and retire. And after Pius, we have the succession of John 23, whose motto is obedience and peace. Again, peace, another one of these points of the triangle here that we're going to talk about. Now, I found the research about John 23 here to be fascinating because I am particularly interested in that period of time that you all know of as the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Kennedy administration. There's a fantastic film that I recommend if this is an area that you're interested in called 13 Days. I'm not always a giant Kevin Costner fan, but he's in it. He's actually pretty good. And it talks about those days there of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Kennedy's reaction to the difficulties associated with that. There was a tremendous amount of stress, and those of you who are over the age of 40, probably older, maybe can remember I certainly remember hearing my parents talk about how intense those days were. I did not know, however, that it looks like John 23 should get a statistically significant amount of credit for ending that crisis. John, by way of a radio address, basically calls the two nations out and says that it is in fact contrary to the goodness of God's law and to the goodness of all people to pursue an action that would certainly end life on earth. He gives this papal address, and that address then appears on the front page, within 2 days, on the front page of the Soviet national newspaper. And it is not long after John's papal address in which he recommends that the United States end the blockade and surrender their missiles in Turkey, in exchange for which the Soviets would surrender and dismantle their devices in Cuba. That is, in fact, exactly what occurred. It was John's recommendation, and I didn't know that, and I found that to be an interesting piece of the puzzle that at least for myself, had been left out of the discussion up until that point in the research. Pope Paul VI continues. With him on the Mount, of course, is a reference to the Sermon on the Mount. Paul VI went to the United Nations General Assembly, to give an address and announces right at the beginning of his speech, "No more war, war never again." And he follows by saying, "Arms, and especially the terrible arms that modern science has provided you, engender bad dreams, feed evil sentiments, create nightmares, hostilities, and dark resolutions, even before they cause any victims and ruins. They call for enormous expenses. They interrupt projects of solidarity and of useful labor. They warp the outlook of nations. But your courage and your good qualities urge you on to a study of means that can guarantee the security of international life without any recourse to arms." I realize that in this age that references to the United Nations are met with conflict at a minimum. But you've got to remember here that at the time he's giving this speech, we are a mere 20 to 25 years after the Second World War. The United Nations at the time seemed like a wonderful opportunity for the community of world nations to never be confronted with the nightmare scenario of an all-encompassing war surrounding the globe again, especially given the effects of nuclear war. John Paul I was in his office, sat in the papacy for 33 days. I don't know if he is the shortest in history. Again, not a Catholic historian. But did echo in that brief amount of time that he was in the chair the sentiments of the popes that preceded him. In particular, John was very interested in this idea of poverty-stricken communities thirsting for peace. This is a phrase that was used by his predecessor, the idea of this thirst for peace and thirst for justice. And he goes on to say that that thirst of peace is so active among citizens struck with poverty that we must be careful with the deployment of this kind of weapon, because it is invariably the poor who suffer first. And this is a strong mission of the church. Its mission with respect to poverty-stricken communities, the underrepresented. Sadly, the reality is in modern times that nuclear war will not affect just the poor. We're past that point. The truth is we're past that point in the 50s. But the reality is now that it is the true universal killer with respect to war. John Paul II. I think John Paul II, for those of us that were Catholic, grew up in the 80s, are Catholic now, this is kind of the everybody's pope. To the extent that a pope was ever a rock star, this was probably it. Seconded maybe by Francis now. But John Paul's involvement internationally was famous and has almost, well, again, with maybe the exception of Francis, was never repeated again. It's hard to imagine a pope traveling as much as John Paul did, working so strongly towards justice, for peace and security. And this despite the fact that he got shot. I mean, the Pope-mobile exists because John Paul got shot. It was an assassination attempt. But he did seem to nevertheless maintain a strong head. On the 40th anniversary of the dropping of the devices on Hiroshima, or the device on Hiroshima, John Paul famously says, "To speak of Hiroshima and of Nagasaki is to become vividly aware of the immense pain and horror and death that human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another. But it is also to be conscious of the fact that such a tragic destiny is not inevitable. It can and must be avoided. Our world needs to regain confidence in its capacity to choose moral good over evil." Moral good over evil. This will become the underpinning for the church's recommendations with respect to disarmament and an end to the scourge of nuclear war. And we'll see that here in just a moment. Excuse me. After John Paul passes away, very briefly, we have Benedict, who likewise continues in the same thread. Benedict Benedict went on again with that similar thread saying, what can be said too about those governments which count on nuclear arms as a means of ensuring the security of their countries? Along with the countless persons of good will, one can state that this point of view is not only baneful but also completely fallacious. In a nuclear war, there would be no victors, only victims. The truth of peace requires that all, whether these governments which openly or secretly possess nuclear arms or those planning to acquire them, agree to change their course by clear and firm decisions and strive for a progressive and concerted nuclear disarmament. The resources which would be saved could then be employed in projects of development capable of benefiting all their people, especially the poor. This is a really good argument, I think, for denuclearization of a nation state. That is the $350 billion that is being spent in updating our devices now might otherwise be spent on those less fortunate, and I don't necessarily, before we get down that road, mean handing them checks, but I mean developing our underdeveloped communities and peoples. Finally, Francis, our current Pope. Francis, for a while, has been stressing me out because he won't stop talking about it, right? So it took a long time for me to finalize my lecture because he just kept adding stuff. But where we are now is that for the first time, a Pope has simply said the possession and use of nuclear weapons is immoral. Full stop. If you've got them, or you're going to use them, those two acts in and of themselves are immoral. They lack moral ground. That's huge. That's a big place for the church to be. But I would, again, argue that this seems fairly consistent with the church's broader concepts associated with peace, justice, and love. The idea of pro-life extending beyond the abortion argument and to all life. In fact, if anything, I have been referring to the church's stance as whole life as opposed to pro-life. It's more whole life, which I think is fantastic. The U.S. Convention of, or the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has made 5 in particular recommendations with respect to denuclearization, excuse me. Urge bold and concrete commitments to accelerate verifiable nuclear disarmament, including taking weapons off of launch on warning status to prevent a catastrophic accident and making deeper cuts into nuclear arsenals. Oppose the investment of hundreds of billions of dollars in modernizing nuclear systems that ultimately we must work to dismantle. Support serious negotiations on a fissile material cutoff treaty and other prudent measures. If it is introduced, urge senators to support ratification of a comprehensive test ban treaty. And finally, encourage Congress and the administration not to take any actions that would undermine the agreement between the P5+1 in Iran, that's the permanent 5+1, that's Germany and Iran, with respect to Iran's nuclear development. Of course, that ship unfortunately has sailed, left that treaty. I want to back up to the launch on warning status. Someday Daryl and I will have to co-teach this more technical aspect of the of nuclear posturing. Launch on warning, however, is probably the most, I don't know, we could argue about it all day, Daryl. I think it's one of the most insidious aspects of nuclear planning out there. And it says simply this: if we detect a launch from our opponent, they get everything. One is all. You send one, and it's a warning. It's not a confirmation, it's a warning. We detect a missile out of Central Russia, Central Asian Russia, they get them all. We've been on and off with our status on launch on warning for a long time, and for a while it ended in the 1990s. It's unclear what our exact status is now, but it is difficult for me to imagine that we would go through all of the effort of updating these devices the way that they are and not returning to a launch on warning status. It doesn't make any sense, and it seems inconsistent with the personality of the administration with respect to this particular issue. Launch on warning was the shadow under which those of us who were alive and remember the United Communities, that is the shadow that we lived under. That's why there was, for many of us living in those communities, this weird sense that every day you woke up, it was a little bit of a surprise that we were not a smoldering heap, because it took very little. And there are a couple times in the, or at least two for sure times during the Cold War where those moments were almost inevitable, but for, like I said, the actions of good people. The Cuban Missile Crisis, certainly, and then again in the 1980s, when the Soviets erroneously detected missiles, a small number of missiles leaving the United States on their way to the Soviet Union, and the radar operator went outside and stood in the direction of Moscow and waited to see if it went up. And it didn't, and so he reported it as a computer error, which it actually turned out to be. He ended up being a buffer against launch on warning, the status that the Soviet Union carried as well with the United States. I don't have a really good conclusion for this. I don't know what to tell you. That is, I don't have anything that I think is comforting. I am deeply concerned that, at least in the United States, and certainly in Russia, right now, there is no political will to stop increasing the size and effectiveness of our nuclear arsenals. We are worldwide now at 13,000 some odd devices. If you look at the available fissile material, that is material that would be used to generate these massive explosions, there's the equivalent of 108,000 devices and fissile materials sitting all over the globe. It certainly takes less than 100,000 to end life as we know it. And one of the great concerns for those in the anti-proliferation movement is this idea that a limited war seems out of reach. There's no incentive for people not to play in the game once it's started. That is, if we, in a fit of anger, decide we're going to nuke Little Rocket Man, at that point, why wouldn't Pakistan nuke India? The game has begun. And once those dominoes begin to fall, it's all of us that take the heat. It's easy in the United States for conversations like this, I think, to be pigeonholed as somehow anti-military or anti-US, and it's quite the contrary. Or at least that's my position on it. This is not some kind of tree-hugging pacifist approach to no military. That's irrational. But I am likewise disquieted by the badassness of the American attitude towards nuclear devices. We use the threat of nuking our enemies with shocking casualness. And it bothers me because I think we have forgotten what the specter of a nuclear war really means. And it means maybe you don't die today if the war happens, but most of us would be stunned to find ourselves alive a year later. That's the reality of nuclear war. It lasts forever, particularly if we are in a launch on warning, everybody gets everything at the same time status. And that's terrifying, and I think we owe ourselves at a minimum, and certainly we owe our children and our grandchildren and future generations the respect and the dignity that we would give any other human being, and dial ourselves away from the further production and threatened use of these devices. There is no point in making them if you're not going to use them. So when you hear arguments, well, we'll never do that, the right question to ask is then why make it in the first place? Because if it's been built to be used. And your voice is an opportunity for those of you concerned. You have an opportunity to say, that's not for me. not interested in watching the world blink out of existence. And I have told my students before, and I know those of you who are from Alito, when we talked about this a little bit earlier this semester, kind of looked at me vaguely like you wanted to vomit, and I get that. But remember, when you leave here, and I'll end with this, and then I'll open it up to questions and discussion in general. But at the end of the day, you are 30 minutes from the end of the world. All the time. That's about how long it takes. And it doesn't matter who fires first. It's about 30 minutes. Whether it's us, or Russians, or the Chinese, or the Koreans, it's about 30 minutes. That's how long it takes. But we can keep that at bay with louder voices of reason. We can keep it at bay. So, if you don't have anything to ask, I will end this as I end all of my classes by telling you that I love you all, and I hope that you will leave here and go be young and awesome, for sure. But in the meantime, if you've got questions, I'd be willing to entertain them. Anyone? Yes?
Not so much a question, just a remembrance from living through some of this era. One of the things I very distinctly remember is the opening of the Persian Gulf War. Watching the at night and the green Scud missiles and all the other stuff going on and all that. And one of the things I remember among my classmates at that point in time was well, why aren't we just using nuclear weapons on this? We're going to fight, we're going to go in and fight. Why are we bothering sending all of our troops in who may die in the process when we could just nuke? I mean, it felt like not just among, I was in high school at the time, not just among high schoolers and all that, but just even on news as much as it existed. We weren't quite 24-hour news channels yet at that point, but I remember that being something that hurt a lot.
Candidly, I would argue, I think, that the moral imperative for that war was somewhat ambiguous.
Yes.
And so,
I talk about that in my history class, yes.
And so it was probably a difficult call to make, to use tactical devices. But the other issue, I think, is its massive disproportion.
Well, that's what I was talking about. Because you were talking about the bravado side of things. That this is just, well, we're in the right because if America wants to do it, then we are in the right. And if we're in the right, then we have the right to use as much force as we see as necessary, especially if it keeps our people from dying in the process of the war. Now, it turns out with Persian Gulf War, our people didn't die very much, but
No, certainly not at the numbers we were killing their side.
Yes, and not predicted from the number 4 military that we were fighting.
Anyone else got questions or comments or concerns or anything? Is that a giant mouth?
I wanted to stay quiet, but I just can't. And I've been fighting with myself.
I know. Listen,
Nick, I was there.
I know. Daryl was there. Daryl worked for the Reagan administration during the 1980s, and Daryl and I differ about our positions on the use of nuclear weapons rather strongly, though we generally agree on the current condition of the nuclear forces.
We need to build them. We need to build them as fast as we possibly can. And because the enemy is, whoever the enemy is, because they will not believe in our will to use them unless we build them. It's because it's like the abortion debate. We dare not outlaw abortion because we keep the option open. Doesn't mean you're going to take the option. You just keep the option open.
Yeah.
I know the analogy may be a poor pro-life analogy, but I'm pro-life too, and I'm pro-life, and I'm not a poet, professor. I'm a political scientist, and I would rather see a capitalist society victorious over a communist society.
Again, I don't have a particular. It's not really a particular issue for me about the survivability of capitalism over communism, which at this point capitalism won. We just have to admit. Capitalism destroyed communism for the most part. My concern isn't, it's not the rational minds that concern me. It's the irrational minds that concern me. Because the conversations that we have and other rational people in this community have probably act as a blanket for us in some respect. That is, of course people will act rationally with respect to these devices because we're able to have these conversations because we are very well informed, or there are certainly people who are even better informed in the world relative to these subjects. But I would consider us reasonably well informed about this. We can speak with each other rationally. One of the key aspects to the survivability of the communities in the nuclear brotherhood, as it were, is this concept of Nash's equilibrium, a gaming theory that says that there's no incentive for me to change the game if I know everything about my opponent and I rightly conclude that they are a rational actor. The inverse must also be true. My opponent must likewise conclude that there is no incentive for them to change the game if they know everything that they can about me and rightly conclude that I am a rational actor. But it is that rational actor part of the game that causes the concern, because there isn't a way out once that game has begun. Okay, there's not an incentive just to not fight. So, I don't know.
It could be a moot point. Mankind may go out with a whimper due to the coronavirus rather than
Coronavirus may make it over. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a statement.
Yes.
I'm a veteran, and I like my history teacher, I love Teddy Roosevelt. And we don't speak softly and carry a big stick.
Yes.
And to me, that big stick that we carry are nuclear weapons.
Sure.
And at that same time, Europe is developing the big sticks that drives them into World War I because they have so much stuff that they have to use,
Well, we
all this
just need to make
expensive
sure our
stuff that
stick
they
is bigger. And that's why I say,
That's
hey, I'm a
what Germany,
taxpayer.
that's
I'd
Germany
rather-
versus Great Britain, is which one can get
My
bigger.
$350 tax-paying $1 billion is spent on the military and on nuclear weapons and on feeding on the people that I'm armed, my taxes are already.
Right. And I do absolutely understand this argument, and it makes sense, provided nobody ever actually uses a stick. That's the problem. The stick is
They're all dead.
the problem with that stick is that if it's used,
We're all dead.
we've not saved anything. We've ended the planet.
Life is a chance.
I suppose that's true. I'm just not sure that's what I want to take. But I totally do understand your position. Anyone else? Yes.
What if, this might be a crazy thought, but
Very probable.
what if we're creating nuclear weapons? All nations are creating nuclear weapons because there's an unknown enemy. That might, no, seriously. If humans alone are too naive to think that we know everything so far, we know everything about our opponent, everything, every aspect, it's possible that there might be another party that's in the shadows that we don't know about.
Yeah. That the pure theoreticals of that are interesting, but they're not. But in terms of policy, they're not pragmatic. The only way policy is effective is if it's open and transparent. If the policy of the world community of nuclear, in the nuclear brotherhood, is to develop and amass these weapons for for this enemy that only they know about, then the policy is bad because it's not open and transparent. So I'm disinclined generally to chase down conspiracy theories of that type, absent some rather glaring evidence. And the truth is, I think Occam's razor probably answers this question. The least complicated answer is probably the correct one.
Yeah.
And the least complicated answer here is that we find security in the idea that nobody would be dumb enough to end the world. But if that's true, then what's the point?
Yeah.
What's the point? Yes.
So, consider like 1.2 billion some odd Catholics. So do you think the church has a bigger responsibility to not just condemn these things, but play a bigger role in denuclearization?
I do, and that's why I think that the efforts, like the efforts of the Conference of Bishops, the papal statements, the changes to the catechism, the willingness of Francis to simply say the possession and use of these devices is immoral, those are huge steps. And with 1.2 billion Catholics, at least I know. At least as I understand it as as a new Catholic, or new about to be Catholic, it's going to require us as Catholics to look inside and see where we land. That is, are we prepared to watch the death of millions of innocent people for a false sense of security? I don't know. I don't know where everybody else lands, and it will, I think, depend greatly on their relationship with the church. So, yeah. Anyone else? Get out of here. Go be young and awesome.